Hello, my name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 23 is entitled COL James Cooper Nisbet and the 66th Georgia at the Battle of Peachtree Creek, and relies on his book, 4 Years on the Firing Line, which he published in 1914. At the beginning of the war, James Cooper Nisbet lived in Dade County, Georgia, and wanted to enlist in the company that his neighbor, John B. Gordon, raised in response to the call of troops made by Governor Joseph E. Brown. Gordon declined this request. He believed that James Nisbet could better serve the Confederacy as a company commander. James Cooper Nisbet raised a company of infantry in July and became its captain. An interesting policy within his home state at that time was that Georgia regiments did not form within its own borders. I had notified Governor Brown that my company was ready to report to the camp of instruction, and was informed that other companies were ahead of mine, that I would have to wait. It took a political pull in those early days of '61 to get off to war. I should have used my father's influence. Later, it was not so hard to get on the firing line. Captain Nisbet and his company traveled to Richmond by train, and upon arrival, entered into service as Company H, 21st Georgia. While in the 21st Georgia, Captain Nisbet fought in the Valley Campaign and from the 7 Days Battles to Fredericksburg. The War Department in Richmond selected Captain Nisbet in January 1863 for promotion to colonel, but it was contingent on him recruiting a regiment of his own. Major General Howell Cobb, an old friend of his, and the commander of the Department of Middle Florida, had the authority to recruit in Georgia. With his endorsement, the War Department approved James Cooper Nisbet's promotion to colonel, and he traveled back to Georgia to raise his regiment. Captain Nisbet selected Macon, Georgia, as his headquarters. He targeted ex-soldiers desiring to re-enter the fight as officers to form and lead his companies. He took out ads in newspapers across Georgia, such as Southern Banner in Athens, the Macon Telegraph in Macon, the Savannah Republican in Savannah, and the Confederate Union in Milledgeville, whose headline read, "We ask the attention of our young men throughout the state to the call made upon them by Captain J. Cooper Nisbet of Macon. He is a soldier, every inch of him, and if he succeeds in raising his regiment, we predict that it will do good service and win bright laurels. The regiment will be assigned to duty in southern Georgia, affording those who join it an opportunity to go into service near home. The Conscription Act will soon be altered to embrace all between 16 and 45, and young men would do well to select a good position while the privilege is left them." Though Captain Nisbet had the authority to raise his regiment, conscription officers could also recruit within the state of Georgia. On more than one occasion, these men directly interfered with his recruiting efforts. The issue stemmed from the tradition that men of the regiment elected their officers, rather than being appointed. Captain Nisbet selected veteran soldiers as his company commanders, but just as he was not yet a colonel, so too were these soldiers not officers until the regiment filled its ranks. The conscription officers did not recognize the company commander's authority, which affected recruitment efforts. Captain Nisbet appealed this complication in person at Richmond, but it was denied. Not only that, but the men he wanted from the 21st Georgia to serve as officers was also denied, because taking men from that regiment would effectively reduce it to a battalion. Despite additional recruiting difficulties, the companies filled their ranks across the state and converged on Macon, where the regiment formed. 13 companies in all formed under the authority of Captain Nisbet. He brought the roster of his regiment to Richmond and was given the designation of the 66th Georgia, and James Cooper Nisbet received the rank of colonel, with an official muster date of 11 August 1863. The 3 extra companies became the 26th Battalion Georgia Infantry, and led by his brother, Major John W. Nisbet. By May of 1864, Colonel Nisbet and the 66th Georgia were assigned to Brigadier General Clement H. Stevens's brigade in Major General William H. T. Walker's division of Lieutenant General William J. Hardee's corps in the Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston. From May to July, the 66th Georgia participated in the Atlanta campaign, which were a series of battles, such as Kennesaw Mountain, that contested Major General Sherman's advance toward Atlanta. General Johnston's tactics in opposing Sherman's advance were not aggressive enough for the Confederate government, and appointed Lieutenant General John Bell Hood as his replacement, who took command of the Army of Tennessee on 18 July. Colonel Nisbet and his regiment marched past General Johnston's headquarters that same day. 'Twas a sad day for us. He stood with head uncovered. We lifted our hats. There was no cheering. We simply passed silently, with heads uncovered. Some of the officers broke ranks and grasped his hand, as the tears poured down their cheeks. We knew that General Johnston had managed his campaign with skill. The morale of his army at that time was as good as it could be. During the Atlanta campaign, Lieutenant General Hood was a corps commander in the Army of Tennessee and had been twice wounded from battles such as Gettysburg. Colonel Nisbet also knew of him from his time in the Army of Northern Virginia and commented about his abilities as a leader. There was no better division commander than John B. Hood, but as the commander of an army in the field, he was a failure. He demonstrated his incapacity to take Joe Johnston's place. Jeff Davis unwittingly hit the Southern Confederacy a heavy blow that morning. General Johnston planned an attack upon the Union Army as they crossed Peachtree Creek, which is north of Atlanta, and once in command, Lieutenant General Hood decided to follow through. Major General Sherman split his army in two and ordered Major General Thomas's Army of the Cumberland to cross Peachtree Creek, while the rest of his forces marched on Atlanta from different directions. This gave the Confederates an opportunity to engage an army that was similar in strength, and if timed properly, while it was conducting a water crossing. Not only did the Army of the Cumberland cross unopposed, but they also managed to construct makeshift breastworks before the Confederates attacked. Colonel Nisbet and the 66th Georgia posted along the Peachtree Road and advanced against the Federals that afternoon. We advanced and drove in the enemy's skirmishers. There was a considerable gap on my left. I protested against advancing until this gap was filled, but the order was given, and the line went in with a rush, right up to the well-constructed earthworks. My regiment and the regiment on my right, the 1st Georgia Confederate Infantry, captured the works in our front, but we were unsupported. The enemy on my left, not being assaulted, continued to enfilade my line. Seeing fresh troops being rushed up against us, I was certain we could not hold the position. The 66th Georgia's left flank became exposed because of Lieutenant General Hood's guidance for an echelon assault. Instead of all divisions assaulting at one time, the rightmost division would attack first, and the next division would advance in line from right to left. As Colonel Nisbet's regiment was on the left flank of his division, he would have no support on his left for some time. Brigadier General Nathan Kimball commanded the brigade from the 4th Corps that faced them, and was himself on the right flank of his corps. The left of the 20th Corps had at this time crossed Peachtree Creek, but had not come up, so my right was entirely uncovered. Arms were stacked in line, and every man fell to work with the greatest activity to throw up breastworks. But these were hardly commenced when, at 3 p.m., a rapid firing was heard on our picket line in my front. My skirmishers were driven in, closely followed by the enemy in 2 lines of battle, charging with great confidence with a rapidity and absence of confusion I have never seen equaled. My men seized their guns and formed to resist the enemy's advance. He was repulsed with terrible loss in our front. Brigadier General Kimball, while engaging Colonel Nisbet and the 66th Georgia, among other regiments, recognized the disjointed Confederate attack to his right, Colonel Nisbet's left, and shifted the 73rd Illinois to form a right angle and defend against a movement on his own exposed flank. Brigadier General Kimball continues. When the enemy had been repulsed by the left of the 20th Corps, he was obliged in retiring to expose himself to an enfilading fire from this regiment. This fire was so deadly that great numbers of the rebels covered themselves in a small ravine and were captured by the 20th Corps. Colonel Nisbet and the 66th Georgia were ordered to fall back by their brigade commander, who was killed after giving the order. In this assault, he estimated the regiment suffered 25% casualties. As the regiment returned to the Confederate main line, Colonel Nisbet met Brigadier General Mark P. Lowry, who commanded a brigade of Mississippians and Alabamans. Colonel Nisbet warned Brigadier General Lowry that the enemy had constructed breastworks, but Lowry didn't believe him. Colonel Nisbet summarizes the exchange. Colonel, you must be mistaken about the enemy being fortified. General Hood informed me that they had just crossed the creek. Brigadier General Lowry was determined to assault the Union line, and Colonel Nisbet offered the 66th Georgia to support him. I deployed and drove back their skirmishers, who had advanced as we fell back. I halted my line in full view of their breastworks, and waited for Lowry to come up. After viewing the situation, he agreed with me that it would be a useless waste of lives to assault their works again, with what force we had. We returned to our original line. Brigadier General Kimball's brigade, still in their fortifications, met the Confederates' advance. Repulsed at every point where he met Union troops, the enemy fell back, and reforming his lines, made another desperate attempt to drive us from our position, but with no better success than before. Still, he kept up a rapid fire, and seemed persistent in his efforts to find a weak point through which he could force his way, until about 6 o'clock, when he retired, leaving most of his dead and wounded where they fell. It is interesting to see this exchange between Colonel Nisbet and a superior officer, just how much confidence the Confederate Army had in Lieutenant General Hood at this battle. Having failed in one assault already, the viewpoint of this regimental commander was not enough to convince a brigade commander to forego an assault. The information that Lieutenant General Hood had on hand was only partially true. The 20th Corps section of the Union line had no fortifications whatsoever, while other sections besides the 4th Corps had enough time to construct them. Colonel Nisbet's final comment about the Battle of Peachtree Creek critiques whoever conducted the reconnaissance of the Union line prior to its ill-fated assault. It will be seen that the enemy had crossed the Peachtree Creek the evening before and fortified, and that Hood was acting on misinformation, and he emphasizes this word in italics. The fight was a miserable affair on his part, from start to finish, in which, for the want of concert of action, the Army lost many valuable lives and accomplished nothing of benefit. James Cooper Nisbet published his book, 4 Years on the Firing Line, in 1914. The foreword to his book reads with dissatisfaction with the contemporary scholarship on the Civil War. All important facts mentioned are verified from the statements and records of our friends, the enemy, meaning Confederate and Union. And he continues, the fear of offending established views destroys the power of investigation. I write without fear or favor, with the unhindered pen of limpid candor, moved by the fighting soul of a fighting man, proved in the long ago. Thank you for listening to the 23rd episode. The link to James Cooper Nisbet's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Colonel Nisbet sometime between 1863 and 1865. I'd like to thank my audience for their patience over this past week, as I was feeling under the weather. I announced the delay of the episode on social media and on the news page of the podcast website, so please follow the podcast on these platforms. I did post pictures of the ruins of the Fayetteville Arsenal last Wednesday, so if you haven't yet, go check them out. Links for all social media accounts are at the top of each webpage. Sergeant Charles Augustus Fuller of Company C, 61st New York, provides next week's first-person account at the Battle of Glendale. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.